So at the risk of being repetitious, I've sat in coffee shops with other preachers and asked the question, some of the believers in the past, that's just a big blind spot. Like the founding fathers, they owned slaves. What were they thinking? And then 150 years ago, it was a common practice for Baptist preachers to smoke. What a blind spot for us now, right? When we look back. But then it makes us ask the question, in 2050 or 2075, if Jesus tarries, what are going to people look back on Americans in 2024 and say, what were they thinking that was so blaring as far as the fault that they had? And have a hunch what it's going to be. Materialism. Their God was stuff. They loved their stuff and their comfort and their ease. So, I want to cover that in the next few weeks. A series entitled Counterfeit Gods. This was birthed in a book that was written by a man named Timothy Keller, Presbyterian pastor who recently went home to be with the Lord. If there's anything that I say that is good in this series, it probably came from Timothy Keller, okay? But it is not just reteaching his book, just to clarify that. But I want to give credit where credit is due. The seed thought came from him by reading that book about a year and a half ago. And I thought, man, he is tackling a blaring issue in our society. Which leads me to another question. What does this have to do with Wednesday night? We're moving in the kitchen. We're learning how to serve. How does counterfeit gods deal with serving? Well, let's go back to the Great Commandment. When the attorney asked Jesus, what is the Great Commandment? He said, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So let me paraphrase. Keep God number one. Worship God first. Make him your leading affection. And then after that was in place, he said, and the second is like unto it, love thy neighbor as thyself. The point is this, that unless our affections are lined up with God properly, we will not be able to serve others as we should. Does that make sense? Based on the Great Commandment? So the next 6, 7, 8 Wednesday nights, we just want to focus on that commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. So I think it'd be appropriate tonight to get the kids involved at the outset. You adults can turn to Genesis 22. That's where our text is going to be this evening. But then I want to ask if all kids 12 and under that want to hear a story, come on up here to the platform, sit on my left, and I want to start with a story tonight. Because we need to set the table to what is going on here. Right over here to my left. And just sit like quiet little Indians, Indian style. Got another couple coming. Maggie's welcome to come up here too if she wants to. All right, Leo, you're going to come up and join us? All right, you're right here, buddy. There we go. Okay. Everybody comfortable? All right, I'm going to tell you a story. And we're going to cover 25 years of time in about 4 minutes. Okay? 4 minutes. You ready for this? There was once a man named Abram who was worshiping many, many gods, had never heard of Jehovah God, but God broke through to him and said, I want you to get out of your daddy's house. I want you to get out from your family. I want you to go to a land which I'll share, that I'll show you hereafter, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Now, let's think about this for a moment. He didn't have any kids. You know how old Abraham was? He was 75 years old. Do you know anybody who's 75 years old? You might have a grandma or grandpa that's around that age, 70, 75 years old. Let me ask you a question. Do 75-year-olds have kids? Typically not. Typically not. So he's 75, she's 65, and then they follow God. They go to this promised land. They finally go to a place that we would call Israel today, and they set up their tents. And God's not answering the prayer. Now it's 15 years later. How many years later, Caleb? How many years later? It's 15 years later. 15 years later. Just making sure y'all are paying attention, okay? So 15 years later, now Abraham is 90, and then you have Sarah, and she is 80. No kids whatsoever. So you know what Abraham's going to do? He's going to help God out. And so what he does is he takes his servant girl and has his servant girl have a kid to claim that kid as his son. And they called the name of that son Ishmael. Now Ishmael, he started growing up. He became 10, he became 11, he became 12, 13, 14 years old. He's a teenager now. And Abraham and Sarah don't have a kid together. But then there were a couple of men that showed up to their tent one day. And he looked at Sarah and said, by this time next year, you're going to have a baby boy. She's 90 years old. You know what Sarah did? That is so funny. She laughed. And so, you know what the angel told Sarah? I want you to name this boy Isaac, which means laughing. To remind her that she had not believed God. She laughed at what God had said. So, a year passed. You know what happened in the next year? Anybody want to guess? What happened in the next year? Lily? She had a baby boy. And what did they call the baby boy? What was the name? Gabriel? Isaac. You got it. You've been listening well. And they finally had a baby boy. Well, this was their pride and joy. They took this baby everywhere. You have a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old mother, and they're pushing the stroller down the street. Can you imagine? Hey, nice great-grandkid. No, that's actually my kid. Can you imagine that? And they're just taking care of little Isaac. He's growing older and older and older. And then God is going to test Abram, because now Isaac is about 14, 15 years old, and God is going to see how much he is willing to give up. Hey, so I want to ask you a couple questions, okay? This is just freebies, okay? I want to see how well you listen. What was the name of the man who God promised to give a kid to? Abraham. What was his wife's name? Do you remember? Sarah. Good job. And then what was the baby boy's name when he finally came? Isaac. That's good. And then God was going to test them. You listened so well. I want to continue the story, but we got to read the Bible to see what happens next, okay? So you run on back to your parents. Thank you so much for listening. You adults, catch up to speed on what's going on in the story. So here we are in Genesis chapter 22. And the questions become, if Abraham finally had his heart's desire granted, what was Abraham waiting for all this time? Was he just waiting for a son? Or was he waiting for God to show himself powerful? Was Abraham's goal to have the desire of his heart met? Or was the goal to get closer to God? Was his number one love his son? Or was his number one love God himself? So God was going to test the affections of Abraham's heart to see where he stood. And I want to read in Genesis chapter 22 to see exactly what is going on in this chapter. We're going to start by reading verses 1 and 2 to begin with. We'll eventually make it through about verse 19 this evening. Notice what it says. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering up on one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, help us to understand what you're up to with Abraham. And oh Lord, I pray that we would see our own Isaacs the sin of our own affections, and how you go after the sin of our own affections so that we would love you more. For this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. God's concern with Abraham is that his affection, his desire being met, would become an idol in his heart. Now let me ask you a question from the get-go. Do you struggle with idols? Do you struggle with idols? You don't bow down and worship any graven images or statues in your home. You don't have even Buddha dolls hanging out, by your front porch. You don't have any stuff like that. So idols, what are you talking about? Let me define what an idol is. An idol, biblically, is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your affections more than God does. Anything that you seek to give you what only He can give you. You say, where do you get that in the Bible? Psalm 73, the psalmist said, Asaph, whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee. At that moment, Asaph was not an idolater, but anything short of that is idolatry. Does that make sense? That's a very high standard as far as what idolatry is not. So to worship the true God means He is our leading affection and desire in life. That's the first commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. In other words, you need to worship your God and your God alone. So, our hearts, here's the problem, are idol factories. We constantly make anything an idol. The center of our affections, the number one thing that we're desiring. And so, a job can quickly become an idol. As we've seen in the last week and a half, your schedule can become an idol. And you're not aware of that until it's turned upside down. Your food could be an idol. Your family. It's good to love your family, but your family, whether siblings, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids, could be that idol. That vehicle could be an idol. That boyfriend, that girlfriend, the one you're pursuing, could be an idol that you're giving your affection to more than God Himself. So here's the challenge with idols. We typically do not know we have idols until God challenges them, until they are endangered in some way. Because as long as we have our idols and they're not threatened, oh, we're good. I go to church. Of course, I love God. I read my Bible. I do this. I do evangelism. I serve God. I have my ministry. I'm good. And we have no idea the idols in our own heart until God begins to intervene, like He did in Abraham's life. So what's going on in this text? Notice, first of all, that God tested Abraham's affections. He had tested Abraham's affections in verses 1 and 2. Now, we're going to use our imagination a little bit here, apply as we go. But in verse 1, it came to pass after these things, so this is after Isaac has been born, Isaac is now a teenager, that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. Now, we don't know how God spoke to Abraham. We don't know what the interaction was exactly or the context, but we do know this. Abraham was very willing. His hands were up saying, I'm surrendered to whatever you want, God. Here I am, Lord. I'm willing to do whatever you ask. Blank check. Here we go. But then in verse 2, notice the request and how calculated it is. Take now thy son. Now, this isn't one of your sons. Thine only son, Isaac, the desire of your heart, that son that you waited 25 years to receive, and that you've enjoyed for just around a decade and a half. It goes on and says, whom thou lovest. God knew how dearly He held His son Isaac. And get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. Now, in this request, God was aiming with three aspects in mind. The first aspect is God was aiming at that which was valuable. God's not worried about trying to take things that are garbage to you or to me. He wasn't going to take a goat from Abraham's livestock. He wasn't worried about taking a camel or some kind of possession, a money stash over here. That was not close to Abraham's heart. His son was. And so he aimed for that which was valuable, but then he aimed in a way that was unexpected. It's like, where did this come from? This is random that he would ask for this out of the blue. I mean, this is happily ever after. After all, I mean, look at the track record. I have trusted the Lord for 25 years, and here we have our son a decade and a half later. Everything is bliss in the Abraham household. But God wasn't done yet. It was totally unexpected. And then also something else he was going after was any sense of entitlement. Now, we look at this request. We say this is totally illogical and unreasonable. Now, from our Western modern mindset, it is. But in ancient times, there's actually some logic and reason behind Abraham's request. You say, how so? Well, in ancient culture, and you can see this later in the book of Exodus, God required the firstborn son as his. You say, where do you get that? The book of Exodus, chapter 14, before the people are carried out of the land of Egypt, what did he do? He said, put blood on your doorpost, and if you don't, I'm going to take your firstborn. And you see the picture painted throughout the book of Exodus that I am taking the firstborn to atone for your sin. That is almost like my claim, because you fall short, the firstborn is mine. You say, maybe work this out a little bit. Well, what happened after the Egyptians had enslaved them for 450 years? What was the last plague? What did the Egyptians lose? Their firstborn sons, right? All throughout Egypt. And then as the people left, God gave them instructions that, hey, all the firstborns are mine. But I'm going to take the tribe of Levi, and I'm going to claim them as my firstborn, my servants, so you can keep your firstborn. And you can read that throughout the Old Testament. The point is this: Abraham, being a patriarch, being in this day, was already probably aware, at least in their culture in this time, that God or the gods had a claim on the firstborn. And so it was as if God was saying, hey, remember, you fall short. You're not entitled to your firstborn son. And I'm asking for it back. And it reminded Abraham, I'm just using my imagination for a moment, that he fell short. He was not entitled. And this is God's in the first place. And so it's not totally illogical as far as his request. Now, it's a scary request. I'm not minimizing the request. But nonetheless, there is a little bit of logic behind it. The firstborn was God's way of covering the family's sins. Now, when you look at this idea of entitlement, I think that would be a good word to describe many of our affections or desires. A few years ago, I hiked Spencer's Butte with some of my kids. We're at the top, beautiful cloudless day, blue skies, the sun just radiating down on us. We pull out our sandwiches, we're going to eat them on the top of Spencer's Butte, and sure enough, what sticks its head up? A squirrel. And it's just sitting there, with its paws up, waiting for some food. I'm like, I'm going to get rid of this thing. So I toss it a piece of bread. It jumps on that piece of bread, eats it, goes away. And I'm like, I'm done with, I finally got rid of it. No. Now it comes back with like 2 or 3, like sticking their heads up at me, right? What's the problem with these squirrels? They're entitled. I fed them once, they want more bread. And now they're becoming demanding. They're dependent upon our bread. And I'm like, boy, hikers have trained these squirrels well, haven't they? Over the years, especially on these hot summer days. What I saw in the squirrels on that day, I think is what God often sees in us. He gives us, hey, here's some bread. Hey, here's this. Here's that. I'm ready. Give me more, Lord. Give me more. It would become very entitled. You say, I don't know if I'm entitled. How did you function the next day when you didn't have electricity? As an example. No, we just lean and depend on certain things, don't we? I mean, that's our condition as people. We get used to something, we depend upon it. We constantly need to be aware of entitlement slipping in, because that is closely associated with the idea of hanging on to something too dearly. But even more than that, God sometimes makes requests of you. For example, He puts you in a job situation, and you love this job, but your boss or the company might be asking you to do something against your convictions or that's unethical. And if you do it, you can keep your job. But if you don't do it, you lose your job. And God is putting you into place to explore your affection, to say, am I number one or not? He's testing you. Could be a child that you have that becomes deathly sick, and you're begging God to heal this child. The apple of your eye right here, and you don't want God to take him home yet. After all, parents were never wired to bear their own children, and so you're crying out to God, you're asking God to do something here, but the question comes up in your own mind and your heart, who am I desiring more? My child or my God? And see, God, He puts us in these situations to test our affections. And so interpret testing not as an attack on you, but as God going after your affections to see what is number one. I think we saw that a little bit last week. I touched on it with the ice storm. Suddenly, you come home after 5 o'clock in the evening and there's no power. Your phone is dead. The outlets don't work. And all these things that you were depending upon, and you find yourself getting irritated with everybody. And plus it's cold. It's 20 degrees outside. And that can be revealing something that God is testing me to see what my number one affections are in all this. Or maybe day number 3, you've worked a full day, the schedule's getting back to normal, but man, you are hungry. And you sure hope that dinner's on. But you come home, no power, no nice meal for you, PBJ it is. And you're angry about it, you're frustrated. Well, it shows that probably there was an idol in your heart at that moment, some affections that were misguided, and it showed in the frustration that maybe you felt at that moment. You see how idols subtly slip into God, constantly tests them when those idols are no longer there or they're threatened. God is testing our affections to see where they are directed. Now, I know what you might be asking, because I ask the same thing, but shouldn't we fight for our possessions? Don't we believe in personal property? We shouldn't just let people take our possessions or not even care when things go away. Well, you're right. You need to stand up for what is yours. I get that. But I think the question is, what is your number one desire? Is it this possession? Is it this family member? Is it this amenity in life? Or is it God at this particular season or moment in our journey? So God tested Abraham's affections in verses 1 and 2. But notice, secondly, that Abraham surrendered this affection. He surrendered this affection. Look at what it says in verse 3. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. Now notice a couple things about Abraham. How long, looking at verse 3, talk to me for a moment. How long did Abraham deliberate about this? How many days? How many days did he deliberate about this based on verse 3? You see the text? How many days? None. The next morning, right? Kind of a trick question there. And then if it says in verse 3, when they arrived, how many days did it take to get to this spot? Look at verse 4. What does it say? How many days? 3 days. So this is immediate obedience, and it's very high cost to get there. And then in verse 5, it goes on and says, "And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you." Now what faith? Hebrews chapter 11 says that he believed that God was able to raise him up. In other words, if I sacrifice my son, God can resurrect him. What faith that we see here in verse 5. Look what it says in verse 6. "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Notice again the faith in verse 8. "And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son." Climax of the story, the knife is raised. What's going to happen here? Now, let's hit the pause button. We're going to keep Abraham paused in this position just for a couple minutes, because you realize what's going on in this story? It's not just Abraham surrendering his affection to God and obeying immediately. Look at the compliance of Isaac. Look at the faith of Isaac. This is a teenage boy, 14, 15 years old. If there's a wrestling match between a 14-year-old and a 114-year-old man, who's going to win? That's not a pretty picture. So that shows that Isaac was willingly laying down on the altar and letting his dad put there. You talk about Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, a living sacrifice, here it is. But a couple things I want to highlight. What affection, what center of your desire would God ask from you? What is that aspect when you think of potentially losing this aspect of your life, you lose sleep over it? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be passionate about our kids or our job or our money or our comfort. But let's be realistic for a moment. If you value your comfort, and I think all of us do to a certain degree, but God brings a person into your life that is so annoying that disrupts your comfort and turns your world upside down because of this annoying individual, it could be that God is just testing your affection to see what number one is. Or you value your investments and making sure your financial future is secure and in order, and yet God throws this curveball of medical bills your way that obliterates a good portion of your financial security and that stability you see in the future. It could be that God is testing your affections. Or it could be that you're clipping along and you're enjoying really good health, and you're like, well, yeah, God is my God, but God brings this microscopic bug called a virus, latches a hold of your body and spreads throughout your body and undermines your health and compromises your energy. And suddenly you're at a fork in the road where you're asking, okay, what's my number one affection? God or my health? What am I holding to most dearly here? You see, this is how God works in our lives. He's not asking for your firstborn son. He sometimes asks for what you hold dearly. And it's threatened, it's challenged, it's compromised in some way. Abraham surrendered that affection to God. So God tested Abraham's affection. Then Abraham surrendered that affection. But notice thirdly, what is God doing in this? God showed that he was worthy of Abraham's chief affection or desire. Let me say that one more time. It's up on the keynote behind me. But it says, God showed that he was worthy of Abraham's chief affection. Now in verse 11, we pick up with the story. The knife is still raised up in the air. What's going to happen? Well, you know the story because you've read ahead already, but look at what it says in verse 11. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. God provided a lamb. He said, I'm not interested in having your son back right now. I'm just testing you. I will provide in ways that you did not expect. But notice what God was really doing here. In verses 15 through 19, there are blessings that are poured out from God. Let's look at a few of these blessings here. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abram out of the heaven the second time and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this and hast not withheld thine son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned unto his young men, and they rose up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. Now, you say, God came through. God never lost his son. But the point is this, God was willing to give up his son. He was showing that God was his number one affection, not Isaac. Now, you say, why was this necessary? I mean, God already knew where his affections were. Okay, let me speak hypothetically for a moment. I'm going to use my imagination, okay? So, Isaac is growing up. He's a teenager. Turns 15, 16, 17. If Isaac is the idol of Abraham's heart, one of two things are going to happen in his affection or in his dealing with his son. Either, number one, he's going to want to have his son's approval and do all he can to make his son happy and spoil his son. Or on the other hand, if he's like, this is my son, he's going to be a top achiever, he's going to be an overachiever if it's my way, then he's going to be overbearing on his son and ride him hard so that he conforms to his expectations. You see, there's two extremes you can go when there's idolatry. And by the way, I think this also kind of clues us in on parenting sometimes as well. As far as coddling on one side and pushing too hard on the other. It could be because we are making idols out of our kids. But Abraham could have gone that way. How would that have affected God's blessing on the family if he would have gone that way? If it hadn't been that test, remember, our hearts are idol factories. He could have slipped into that, couldn't he? Now, I'm speaking hypothetically for a moment, but this other aspect is not hypothetical. God did come back and bless him. God already told him that I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. That's back in Genesis chapter 12. 10 chapters before we read this text here, and it's almost word for word the same promise. So what is going on here? Well, if God had given him all this blessing without the testing, remember, our hearts are idol factories. Abraham's heart likely would have gotten so caught up in the blessing that he lessened the blesser in his life. He got so caught up in the gifts that he wasn't so passionate about the giver. He was so focused on what God had done with his hands, he was no longer focused on desiring God's face. That's the instinct in all of us, isn't it? To get caught up in the blessings more than the blesser. And so God was testing him, saying, before I bless you, I want to know where your heart is, Abraham, because I don't want to give you blessing that's going to be idols in your life. I don't want you to continue to raise this son that's going to be an idol. I'm going to test you in his mid-teen years to see where your heart is. And what happened is Abraham passed the test to show that God, you are my God. I desire you above all else. And Isaac, I love him. I love him like my own soul. But you are number one. Isaac is number two. And he made that very clear in Genesis chapter 22. The point is this, that God, I believe, based on this text, revealed the threat of idolatry in Abraham's heart and life, and by doing so intensified Abraham's desire for God. Have you ever had your desires changed or intensified? I got to be honest, it sounds bad. Growing up, I was raised with good home-cooked food by a mom that made food from scratch. But when my nanny and granddad said, Daniel, you want to go with your brother and your sister and get a Happy Meal? I got ecstatic. Like a Happy Meal? Yeah. Forget the home cooking. Let's go after the Happy Meal. I think maybe other kids might be like that sometimes too. That's what I've heard anyway. I loved McDonald's. And as I got a little older, entered my teen years a little bit, I found something. There's a phenomenon that happened when I ate McDonald's. I would eat this meal, down this Big Mac, and I would feel really greasy and not as filled up. That was the first event that happened. And then I went off to college and ate cafeteria food for 4 years. And eating cafeteria food for 4 years, it did something with my desires. When I came home on Christmas break or on summer break, or when I'd visit home, and my mom pulled out that roast and the homegrown green beans and the angel biscuits that are just dripping with butter, my affections had grown up just a little bit by that point. I knew what this good stuff was. I wasn't going after the McDonald's at this point. I wanted my mom's home cooking because my taste buds had matured just slightly, wouldn't you say? In the same way, in our journeys, God brings us to these different tests where we're disillusioned. We realize that leaves me feeling pretty greasy. That's not really filling me up like it did. But he sure does. And when I seek him and make him my number one desire, I am satisfied. I have joy in my life. But it's only through those tests that God brings us where those idols are endangered or threatened or at risk, where God is exploring our heart. He already knows where our hearts are, but we don't know where our heart is. And he's revealing to us what the leading affections in our hearts really are. You say, well, what is the joy of knowing God with all your heart? When you are seeking God with all your heart, that means you give to him first financially, and you see him provide in ways you never thought possible. Whereas if we're hanging on to our money, and that's an idol in our heart, where we're not giving, we're not being gracious to the resources, we don't get to see Jehovah Jireh. We don't get to experience God for who he is, because we have this idol called money in our heart. We miss out this aspect of God. When it comes to the idea of relationships, and we pour our heart in this one individual, and we say, this is the center of my affections. I really want to know this individual. I want to have a relationship with this individual. I want to please this individual. And then we experience disillusionment because they just don't deliver on all that seems to promise there. And then on the other hand, we seek our God. And he follows through on everything that he says. And he delivers. We experience the joy of knowing him, and it shows us how fake that idol is as far as that relationship over there. That person can't deliver to me what my God can deliver, therefore I'm going to seek him number one. And God uses all these different aspects in our life to show us that I am the satisfaction of your soul. I am your Jehovah Jireh. I'm the one who provides for you. These idols, it's going to be disillusionment every time. It's going to leave you feeling hollow and greasy on the inside. And so the point I want you to see tonight from Abraham's life is that God challenges your affections so that you are free to desire and trust him. Did you get that? I want to say that one more time. Don't want you to miss this evening. God challenges your affections so that you are free to desire and trust him. I need an elementary age child who can help me drive this point home before we're done. Can I have okay, if you're between second and the fifth grade, can I have a helper this evening? I'm going to ask if Lily would come up here. Lily, can you come on up here just for a moment? And Lily's going to show what I'm talking about here. How God challenges your affections so that you're free to desire and trust him. Now, come on up here so that everybody can see you, Lily. All right, you might need to shed your glasses because I'm going to do something. Do you mind if we just put your glasses on the pulpit for a moment? Because I'm going to have you do something with your eyes. Are you okay with this? Okay, so go and put those glasses on the pulpit just for a moment. Now, I'm going to give you 2 quarters. And what I want you to do is you hold them out here, and when I say closer, you just bring them up a little closer, and you're heading right to your eyeballs, okay? Okay? So you hold them out like this, and I want you to say closer. You keep moving them back until they're almost like in your eyes, okay? Not actually up against your eyeball, but really close. Okay, so can you hold them up there? Hold them up there. Okay. So, Lily here loves her quarters. She likes her quarters. But Lily, can you still see your daddy over there? Yeah. Okay. Can you still see Brother Ben and Miss Asha? Yeah. Okay, no problem, no problem. Okay, now bring those a little closer. She's getting really excited about these quarters. Okay, now can you still see Miss Katrina and Brother Jesse? Can you still see them? Okay. Can you see Miss Kim and Miss Sue? Okay, so you can still see, okay. Bring them a little closer. Okay, can you look over there and see Brother Michael and Miss Jackie? Yeah. Can you see them as much as you saw your daddy a moment ago? Yeah. Okay, bring them in a little closer. Okay. Now, can you see Miss Barbara right back there? Yeah. You hesitate a little bit. Now bring them in a little closer, like cover totally over your eyeballs. Now try to look out. Do you see Brother Dan and Miss Candy very well? Can you don't? Why?
Because I can't see.
Because you can't see. All right, thank you so much. You can keep those quarters, okay? That's your little tip for coming up here. Thank you so much. You get the point? And as those idols are getting closer and closer, they blind us from our God. We're missing out on all that God has for us. And so what God does is, hey, get those quarters away from those eyes. And he threatens the quarters and takes them out of our eyesight so that we can see him for who he is. We all together on this? And so I want to challenge you, my brothers and sisters, as God has challenged my heart. Those things that light you up, that you're passionate about, that you get excited about, enjoy them. Enjoy them for the glory of God. But when they're threatened, when they're challenged, when they don't deliver, it's time to ask, who is my number one desire in this? Let's go and stand together as we conclude our time together.